Does nonviolent protest work? There's a lot of controversy and different opinions on this topic about whether or not nonviolent protest works. First, let's define our terms. Nonviolent direct action is actions like boycotts, strikes, protests, demonstrations, and organized non-cooperation. In contrast, violent direct action is actions like civil wars and terrorism. So here's the $1,000,000 question. Which one works better, nonviolent or violent protest? I looked through research literature on this question, and what I found surprised me. I thought that there would be some situations in which nonviolent protest works better and other situations in which violent protest works better. But what I actually found is that nonviolent protest works better hands down. Nonviolent political campaigns for change have historically been much more successful than violent campaigns for change. In fact, nonviolent campaigns are successful 53% of the time. Violent campaigns are successful only 26% of the time. So nonviolent campaigns don't always work, but they are still twice as likely to be successful as a violent campaign. In fact, if you look at the most extreme violent campaigns, terrorists are always violent. It's part of the definition of terrorism. Terrorists are only successful 7% of the time. So if you compare the most extreme violent campaigns, terrorism, to nonviolent campaigns, what you're seeing is that nonviolence works 53% of the time and terrorism works 7% of the time. Nonviolent campaigns are much more successful. So now let's answer the next big question. Why? Why are nonviolent campaigns so much more successful than violent campaigns? There are a lot of different reasons why this is true. One is because nonviolent campaigns win legitimacy in a way that violent campaigns just don't. When people on the outside of your political group see you being violent, even if they were going to agree with your ideas, a lot of times other people will say, no, I don't want to have anything to do with that political group. I don't want to have anything to do with those people. So violent campaigns can actually push people away from you rather than helping support you. Nonviolent campaigns gain a lot more legitimacy. A related factor is that nonviolent campaigns are a lot more likely to attract domestic and international support than violent campaigns are. Your campaign is much more likely to be successful if you can gain support not only from the people in your country, but the people outside your country who will feel bad for you or encourage your government to change what it's doing when they see the way the government is treating you. Another major factor is that nonviolent campaigns are much more likely to be able to neutralize the enemy's security forces. Whoever it is you're fighting against, most often they're going to be the leader in power, and they're going to have the ability to call on some kind of security forces, whether it's the police or the military or their own private bodyguards. If you are violent, in most cases, that security force is more than willing to shoot back at you because you're shooting at them. In contrast, with a nonviolent campaign, you're a lot more likely to get their support and sympathy. So when the leader says, kill those protesters, if you've been nonviolent, that military, police, or security force won't be willing to fire on you, and instead they'll turn on the leader. Researchers have found similarly that nonviolent campaigns can compel loyalty shifts among the supporters of the opponents. So say you're marching against a dictator, right? And that dictator is surrounded by people who want to support him. Well, if you are nonviolent, then you're a lot more likely to get that dictator's friends to go against the dictator and support you. If they see that your people are being hurt or unjustly accused of things that you didn't really do, or even murdered, then the people around that dictator are more likely to feel bad for you and then go against the dictator. So they'll switch their loyalty from the dictator to you. Researchers have also found that it's just the fact that nonviolent protest requires large numbers of participants, whereas violent protests tend to not have as many participants. So the fact that nonviolent protesters usually have a large base of people that are supporting them, that also makes them more likely to be successful. Nonviolent protest increases the cost of government repression. What I mean by this is, if you are a violent protester, you are willing to kill the government security guards or military or something like that, then when they fire back at you, most of the people are going to be in favor of what the government did, tamping down a violent resistance. However, if you are nonviolent, for the government to repress you, for them to fire on you, is at a tremendous cost to their own legitimacy. People around them are going to see them as illegitimate because, after all, they fired on nonviolent protesters. So if you're nonviolent, you're actually increasing the government's cost every time they try to repress your movement. And one final point that I saw in the research literature is that nonviolent protest is much more likely to divide the political elite. We kind of hinted at that earlier when we talked about how a dictator's friends might turn against him if he starts firing on nonviolent protesters. But it's not just the dictator's immediate friends and family members who might find that distasteful. There's always a political elite who rule a country, who have a lot of influence and usually a lot of money and power. And if you are nonviolent, you're a lot more likely to divide that political elite, having some of them siding with you and some of them siding with the existing power. Dividing the political elite is one of the key strategies to any sort of political change. So overall, you're seeing a picture of nonviolent protests being much, much more successful at achieving whatever goals it is that they're wanting to achieve. So now let's answer this question. In what circumstances does nonviolence work best? I've seen some kind of philosophical debates online asking, could nonviolent protest have brought down Hitler, for example? Hitler was obviously so violent and so evil and definitely willing to violate people's human rights. Could nonviolent protest have worked against Hitler? Now, of course, nobody knows for sure. We don't have an Earth 2 where we can run an experiment where nonviolent protest attempts to bring down Hitler, where we can see what happens, right? Nobody knows for sure. But what researchers can say is that they have examples around the world of nonviolent protest working even against dictators, even against violent leaders. So, could Hitler have been brought down by nonviolent protest? Maybe. It was probably the best shot that people had to bring him down besides World War II. So let's talk about some of the situations that researchers have proven that nonviolent protests can work. One is bringing down a dictatorship. It is true, dictatorships can be brought down by nonviolent protest. Here's the thing. When protest brings down a dictatorship, so that dictatorship is gone, right? Now, what's going to replace it? When nonviolent protest brings down a dictatorship, it is a lot more likely that the next step is democracy. When violent protest brings down a dictatorship, it's a lot more likely that the next step is just another dictatorship. Great, you got rid of one dictator, now you've replaced it with another. Some examples that historians look at are the Portuguese Revolution of Carnations, which moved from dictatorship to democracy. There was the Philippine People's Revolution, which moved from dictatorship to democracy. There was the Iranian Revolution in 1979, which moved from dictatorship to dictatorship. So researchers can look at examples like this around the world and see what situations make it most likely for a protest to bring down a dictatorship and then move to democracy, which is usually what the people actually want. There is a very good reason why violent protest usually leads to dictatorship. The reason why is that violent protest itself, as the protest is going on, leads to centralization and polarization. If you have a military focused protest, then you usually have like one military leader. It strengthens hierarchy and decreases diversity. It also fosters autocracy. That one military leader very often will bring down the dictatorship that everyone was hoping they would bring down, and then they just install themselves as the new dictator. Nonviolent protest is more likely to disperse power among actors in a way that leads to democracy later, if they succeed. Nonviolent protest depends on a diverse coalition usually, and nonviolent protest fosters compromise. So you can see why nonviolent protest against a dictator is a lot more likely to lead to someone who is not a dictator being the leader, someone who is democratically elected after that dictator falls. Another situation that researchers have found in which nonviolent protest works a lot better than violent protest is when an ethnic community wants political autonomy. So you have some kind of ethnic or racial group that lives in a broader community in a country, and they're wanting to have their political voices heard. They want to be part of the political process in their local area. In some cases, those ethnic communities will become violently looking for recognition, but that ends up not being very successful. When those ethnic communities are non-violently protesting for political voice, that is actually the strongest predictor of success in determining whether or not they're going to get a political voice. Protests and strikes are much more successful than violent tactics. This is probably because these nonviolent protests have a moral advantage. They can gain attention for their cause without creating anger or distrust against the people who are protesting. When this group of people becomes violent, then very often the people outside that group, the rest of the people in the country, will look at that group and say, aha, see, we knew you shouldn't have had a political voice. You're violent and we don't trust you and you're just too angry. Whereas if people are nonviolent looking for a political voice, they gain that kind of legitimacy in the eyes of the rest of the people in that country. I also want to point out that nonviolence works best even against overwhelming and violent forces. For example, East Timor's nonviolent resistance against Indonesia's military occupation between 1988 and 1999 was successful primarily because it was completely nonviolent. They were protesting against military dictatorship, and still nonviolent protest was the best form of protest. Another example of nonviolent protest working well even against a violent opposing force was the Philippines People Power movement to oust dictator Ferdinand Marcos in 1986. So just because your opponent is violent does not mean that you have to be violent too, and in fact, that usually ends up backfiring. Nonviolence is the way to go even against a violent dictator. Now, again, I want to emphasize nonviolence does not always work, but it does give the best odds for success. An example where a nonviolent uprising did not work would be Burma's nonviolent civilian uprising against dictatorship from 1988 to 1990. It didn't work. So now let's just answer this last question. Who uses nonviolent protest versus who uses violent protest? Violent campaigns tend to emerge where there's already an ongoing war, in mountainous terrain, where there is a war in a neighboring state, where there is oil, where the country is already unstable, and where there is religious fractionalization. So you have multiple religious groups that don't get along. In contrast, nonviolent protest tends to emerge where there's higher GDP per capita, so people are already richer, flatter terrain, not mountainous, but flat terrain, and in places where there is an older and more durable authoritarian regime. The protesters who tend to use nonviolent protest more often are educated protesters, especially students. After a civil war, researchers have found that places that have UN peacekeepers are more likely to have nonviolent protests than violent protests. So UN peacekeepers are actually really helpful in keeping violence from sparking and emerging again after a civil war. If people are protesting economic conditions, so in that particular situation, researchers have found that the protests are more likely to be nonviolent if they're being organized by union members or by a political party. So unions and political parties know that nonviolent protest works better than violent protest. Countries with a history of nonviolent direct action are also more likely to have nonviolence. People remember in their history, or maybe even if it was recent enough, that their parents protested in a nonviolent way and it was successful. So countries with a nonviolent history are more likely to continue to protest in a nonviolent way. And one last interesting factoid. Researchers originally thought that countries with more inequality would be more likely to have the poor people protest, but they've actually found that that's not true. The more inequality there is, the less likely poor people are to protest, probably because they already feel so demoralized and hopeless. So, does nonviolent protest work? Yes, absolutely. In fact, it works much better than violent protest. If anyone tries to tell you that this isn't the time for nonviolent protest or nonviolent protest can't do any good, don't listen to that person. They don't know what they're talking about. All the research literature suggests that nonviolent protest gives protesters the absolute best chance of having their goals met. So if you're looking to change something about a political or economic system in your country, go with nonviolent protest.